What is economics? Well, it's a subject that studies the economy, obviously. Or more correctly, it studies all of the many economies and economic choices that we face every day. But there's more to it than that. You'd think economists, of all people, would have come up with a great definition. But they haven't. And their definition is probably the worst. They describe economics as the study of the allocation of resources. Now, please stay with me. I know that is a mind-numbingly boring statement. And I've probably just lost half the viewers. But the thing is, I'm a bit of a nerd, so I looked into it, and it turns out that how a society allocates resources is absolutely critical. It is actually the single biggest factor that makes the difference between a prosperous society and an impoverished one. Let me explain. Modern humans evolved about 300,000 years ago, but for about 299,750 of those years, progress crawled along. Life for most people was nasty, short, and unchanging. Then, in just 250 years, everything changed. Now, I'm not saying that nothing happened during those first millennia. Humanity did make progress, especially after the last ice age retreated around 10,000 years ago. People learned to farm, to trade, and eventually invented money. And by the time we get to the Romans, they'd even created early versions of steam engines and mechanical calculators, the very first forms of analog computers. But progress was slow. You could say it was glacial. So what changed? Why did it switch so suddenly from thousands of years of stagnation into rapid, continuous growth? Well, you've probably guessed that it was the Industrial Revolution. But the interesting thing from an economics perspective is that the Industrial Revolution wasn't driven by new technology or resources. It was driven by a change in the rules that changed people's behaviour. The change in rules began in Britain in 1688 with a bloodless coup that overthrew King James II, an event we now call the Glorious Revolution. Now, there was a lot of religious conflict tied up with it, and some of that left deep scars. But for the purposes of this video, we are going to completely ignore all of that. Instead, we are going to look at the economy, because from an economic perspective, the revolution was crucial. You see, the Glorious Revolution established the supremacy of Parliament over the monarchy. And that meant that, for the first time anywhere in the world, the rule of law took precedence over the arbitrary decisions and whims of kings. The significance of this cannot be overstated. It meant that merchants, inventors, and entrepreneurs could take risks, knowing their property couldn't just be seized by greedy, powerful masters. Secondly, it meant investors could put their money to work with a reasonable expectation that they'd keep the rewards. And finally, it meant, in short, that Britain had created the first system where resources could flow easily, from those who had capital to those who had ideas. And it turns out that that is pretty important for the economy. The results were extraordinary. Countries that adopted property rights and the rule of law have experienced centuries of growth. Those that resisted, clinging to old aristocracies, fell behind. The Bank of England has produced some data that demonstrates this quite well. It has estimated that there was literally no economic growth between 1000 BC and 1750 AD, but that since then, annual economic growth of 1.5% has led to living standards rising over 50 times from the pre-industrial level. And this was all made possible, not by new resources or technologies. As we have seen, basic steam engines had existed for thousands of years. No, the growth that has taken us literally from windowless huts to iPhones and the moon was made possible simply by the efficient allocation of resources. All of this did not go unnoticed. Adam Smith, the father of economics, wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776, in which he described the allocation of resources by an invisible hand in a capitalist society. However, capitalism and markets weren't the only way to allocate resources. As the Industrial Revolution advanced, harsh working conditions and extreme inequality gave rise to new ideas. People like Robert Owen, a Welsh industrialist, started experimenting with model communities where workers shared in the profits. Others, like Charles Fourier in France, imagined cooperative societies built around shared ownership and fairness. And then came Karl Marx in 1848, who published the Communist Manifesto with Friedrich Engels. In it, he argued that capitalism would always concentrate wealth and power in the hands of a few, and that only collective ownership of production could create a truly equal society. Over time, socialist ideas increasingly influenced labour laws, welfare systems and public institutions. There was even the odd revolution. And generally, a more equitable distribution of resources evolved. And while radical socialism didn't work, it was found that reduced inequality boosted both society and the economy. That's because a minimum level of pay isn't just about fairness. It's probably a requirement for capitalism itself to thrive, because workers are also consumers. And without demand, the whole system would grind to a halt. However, the benefits of equality has its limits, especially when it is equality of outcomes rather than opportunities that we are talking about. That's because if everybody is equal, then the incentives to apply yourself or take risks are significantly reduced, and that means economic growth and innovation also reduces. As a result, most modern economies today still predominantly use the capitalist system for allocation. What has succeeded the best is a mixed economy, with private enterprise usually accounting for somewhere between 50 and 70%. But there's also a third way, although it is undoubtedly the worst system of all. The third way is when governments use a mix of corruption, tributes and favours to decide who gets what. This system actually discourages investment and innovation. It even discourages citizens from making any effort, because they can't be sure that some corrupt official won't steal it from them. As a result, economic activity grinds to a halt. That means that corruption is worse than inflicting costs or taxes on activity. Costs and taxes make activities less profitable, but corruption means that quite a lot of economic activity simply doesn't take place. It's actually quite similar to the medieval hierarchies of the past, except that absolute monarchies have been replaced by absolute dictatorships. But the unfortunate thing is, as we have seen, these outdated systems from the past, despite their poor outcomes, probably still have an ability to persist for a very long time into the future. Quick favour, did you know that over 95% of viewers aren't subscribed? If you're enjoying the video, please do hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps promote the channel and boosts its visibility. Thanks, and back to the story. And finally, there is another way society can allocate resources, because markets and governments aren't the only allocators of capital. There's another player, the financial system. Now, since the great financial crisis, banks seem to have got themselves a bit of a bad name. They probably deserve it. But despite all of the flaws of certain bankers, finance has provided a very positive boost to growth and progress. There is a metaphor that describes finance as a time machine that brings ideas and income from the future into the present. Some listeners may cringe at the positivity of that metaphor, but when you put aside past bad behaviour and some dubious product like payday loans, the metaphor has some truth. Think about what happens when someone takes out a mortgage. It is a kind of time machine for money. You pull future earnings into the present to improve your life now. It shifts consumption through time and, when applied wisely, means that credit-worthy individuals get to enjoy the benefits of that house today. Similarly with investment, when an inventor or entrepreneur has a great idea but lacks the funds to make it real, finance is the bridge that allows ideas of the future to be brought forward into the present. It's a remarkable concept that can bring forward to today the inventions, technologies and industries that might otherwise take decades to appear. Fortunately, today, we don't just rely on bankers. Over time, the system has evolved into an entire ecosystem of capital. Today, there are a whole range of instruments, from the stock market and private equity to crowdfunding and decentralized finance. Every one of these financial instruments, no matter how different they seem, is doing the same thing: allocating resources from people who have capital to people who have ideas. And that's why that boring old phrase, the allocation of resources, is actually one of the most important ideas in all of human progress. Because whether we're talking about markets, governments, or finance, how society allocates its resources determines almost everything that follows. Innovation, growth, opportunity, and even fairness. A link for the next video should be on your screens now. Thanks for watching.